Hello and welcome back to Biology for Beginners. Today we're beginning a brand new unit, and the entire unit is all about evolution, which is one of those biology topics that I'm particularly jazzed about, so I apologize in advance if I go off on more tangents than normal. I have told my partner to please stop me if I do that, because I cannot stop myself sometimes. So today we begin chapter 13, which is entitled How Populations Evolve, and we're beginning with, of course, Darwin's theory of evolution. Right now you should be seeing those terms and definition slides popping up around me so that you can either pause the video and grab the vocabulary that we will be using today, or you can head on over to my Patreon page. The link is down in the description below, and you can grab the entirety of my slideshow as a PDF for absolutely free. However, if you do decide to make my day and become a patron, then you will get all of the Bio for Beginners material at least a day in advance. So without further ado, let's get into this. Before we get into the nitty-gritty here, the first thing we need to establish is what is a theory? Now, colloquially, we use the word theory to mean idea. It's kind of similar to how we use the word hypothesis in science. So it's kind of like, I have an idea of blah, 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 blah. We'll also commonly say, I have a theory that blah, 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 blah. Well, scientifically, theory actually indicates something that's way more concrete than just a mere idea or hypothesis. A theory is something that's very broad in scope and actually generates new hypotheses. And not only that, it has a very large body of supporting evidence. Essentially, a theory is something that's going to be constantly tested and refined, and it's pretty much as close to being able to say we know for a fact. Since in science, we never actually say we know for a fact. We say the evidence supports this. So it's very important to keep in mind here that if we're talking with a scientific vocabulary, that even though it is a word that we might use in our everyday life, it does have a technical definition, and if we're talking scientifically, we have to apply the technical definition, not the colloquial definition. And colloquial is just a fancy word to say in everyday life or everyday vocabulary, kind of. I'm massively paraphrasing. Don't quote me that that's the definition, but that's basically what it means, if I wasn't making myself clear earlier. So now that we know that a theory is a very broad idea with a very large body of supporting evidence that generates new hypotheses and is as close to we know XYZ full stop, let's move on. A theory is not just an idea. A theory is a broad concept that explains a very broad thing and is backed up by a large body of supporting evidence. That brings us to Charles Darwin. So let's talk a little bit about his early years before we jump into the story that I'm sure most people have at least been introduced to in their middle school biology class. So Charles Darwin was the son of a physician, and originally he was sent to medical school, but he found it very boring because he was more into being a naturalist. Now, a naturalist is similar to what a modern day ecologist is, just a different word and not quite as specific. But his father, the physician, thought that that wouldn't be a good career for him because he couldn't make lots of money in it. So that's why he originally went to med school. But after he dropped out of med school, he then went to Cambridge University with the intent of becoming a clergyman. Well, the cultural climate of this time that he was growing up, that he was going to university, basically said that the species that they saw around the world are fixed and they do not change. So what you see is what you get, and that's how it's always going to be. and they had a literal interpretation of Genesis. Genesis being the first book in the Bible, and that stated that there's a young Earth about 6,000 years old. So prior to Darwin doing his studies and coming up with what would become the base of the field of evolutionary biology, he entirely believed the young Earth and totally believed everything he had grown up with because of the cultural climate that he grew up in. Keep that in mind, because I know that one thing that's discussed a lot is that Darwin just wanted to be contrary, especially if you talk to the young Earth creationists that still exist today, but that's not the case. He was very much a young Earth creationist at the time that he began his studies and his work that he became most famous for. That brings us to the age of 22, when Darwin set sail on the HMS Beagle. And the whole goal of setting sail on the HMS Beagle was to chart the South American coast. And Darwin was part of this whole expedition as their onboard naturalist. Let's talk about Darwin's sea voyage now, since this is the thing that is really the foundation for his life's work. So Charles Darwin spent 5 years aboard the Beagle, and during these 5 years, he collected specimens. He collected fossils as well as living plants and animals. And besides just collecting specimens, he kept very detailed journals of his observations, specifically talking about the relationships between animals or other organisms and their environment. And one of the fascinating things that he noted was that on the same continent, the organisms from temperate and tropical ecosystems more resembled each other than a temperate organism on continent A and a temperate organism on continent B. Which that was the first thing he really noted and kind of found curious, because based on what he was brought up in, the thing that one would think is that the temperate organisms, it doesn't matter where in the world they are, they're all going to resemble each other, and all the tropical organisms are going to resemble each other. But that's not what he found. Temperate and tropical on continent A resembled each other more than their counterparts on continent B. So that was kind of one of the first discoveries that began to shake his own cultural biases. And the other thing that he noted was that the fossils he was collecting were clearly different and distinct from the living organisms. They may resemble the living organisms, but they were very obviously not the same species. So that brings us to the Galapagos Islands. And this is the part of his voyage that Darwin is most well known for. This is the part of the story that most people hear about, especially if you're going to talk about the finches on the islands. We're not talking about the finches today, just because that story's out there, a lot of people know about it, and we'll discuss it later in other chapters. The Galapagos Islands are these very young volcanic islands about 900 kilometers or 540 miles off the Pacific coast of South America. Now, on these islands, there's an abundance of endemic species. Endemic is just a fancy word that means the species can be found nowhere else. And it's a lot easier to say than the species can be found nowhere else. So, there was an abundance of endemic species living on these very young islands. And while these species resembled those on the mainland, they varied from island to island. So it was clear that they probably descended from the mainland, but they were no longer the same species. They had become their own thing, which shook one of those core beliefs that those that grew up in that day and age believed, that species were fixed. So this brings us to the post-voyage years of Charles Darwin. We have to keep in mind that while he was on the Beagle, he read and began to be influenced by the work of another scientist, Charles Lyell. Now, the specific work that he read was Principles of Geology. Charles Lyell was a Scottish geologist who basically proposed the idea that the Earth was shaped over millions of years, not the thousands, as indicated in the biblical book of Genesis. And he came up with this idea by looking at the Earth in the modern day and kind of thought that, hey, if this is how the Earth acts now, it makes reasonable sense to assume that the Earth has been this way for quite some time, or at least the geological processes have been this way for quite some time. So that's how he came to this idea that it was actually millions of years, not a few thousand. Now, in this day and age, we understand that the Earth isn't even just mere millions of years old, it's actually billions of years old. But this idea of the millions of years as opposed to the thousands of years was the first big step in moving away from this young Earth hypothesis. So when Darwin did return to Britain, what he did was he reflected on his observations, he analyzed all of his collections, and began discussing his work with his colleagues. Because he wasn't the only one starting to come to the conclusions that he came to. He talked to them being his colleagues, who were also starting to kind of head down this same chain of thought. And what resulted was this whole idea of descent with modification. And this was not entirely Darwin's idea. This kind of idea had been floating around for a little while at this point. However, Darwin proposed a mechanism that could be behind this descent with modification idea. And that mechanism is natural selection. And basically, the idea of natural selection is that individuals are going to have certain traits and they're going to vary at least slightly from one to another. And some traits are going to make an individual more likely to survive. And if you're more likely to survive, you're more likely to reproduce. So the individuals with those traits that made them more likely to survive and reproduce, they did better, and those traits got passed down. And the individuals that happened to not have those traits didn't really survive, didn't really reproduce, so their traits became lost. And Darwin's basic hypothesis here was that ancestral populations spread into various habitats over millions of years. At this point, he came to accept Lyell's hypothesis that the Earth was shaped over millions versus thousands of years. And so these ancestral populations of animals spread out, and it took millions of years. And these populations had individuals with modifications or adaptations that fit their environments. And over many generations, these adaptations accumulated and boom, new species. How did he even come up with this idea that you could change over time? Like, doesn't that seem a little bit out of the blue? Especially since Darwin even recognized that he was not going to be able to directly study the evolution of a new species, since that would potentially take millions of years. Well, he didn't need to see a brand new species be developed because there was already evidence around him, specifically the evidence from something known as artificial selection. Now, artificial selection is basically just selectively breeding plants and animals to produce desirable traits in their offspring. It's what we do every single day in the agriculture industry, in the dog breeding world. Artificial selection is how we've created the domesticated plants and animals that we have today. Natural selection is literally just the individuals that happen to have traits that help them survive better in their environment, surviving and reproducing, and those traits being passed on and spreading. Artificial selection is just humans making the choice. So that's the big difference here. And specifically what he looked at here was breeding pigeons, because he noted that all of these fancy pigeons in this image here, they're all the same species. They're different breeds of the same species that come from the humble rock pigeon. And by looking at this, if the rock pigeon could be bred to make all these fun breeds like the fantail, the frillback, the trumpeter that we all see here, then that is a very great visual representation of how the environment and natural selection have worked to shape the species that we have today. It's just that the adaptations that made things survive better ended up being passed on because the individuals that happened to have the adaptation happened to survive and breed. So their genes got passed on. Now, at the time, it's important to keep in mind that Darwin had figured out that natural selection was working. He just didn't exactly know how the adaptations were passed from parent to offspring, since the work of Mendel wouldn't come along until after Darwin had already published his work. We can kind of see natural selection in action today, because if we use pesticides as an example, we'll see that pesticides will be applied to basically a population of insects or pests, and it won't kill every single individual. And one possible reason for that is some individuals end up having a gene that makes them resistant to pesticides, and those individuals that have that gene will survive while the ones without it will die. And then the result is that we'll get a new population that now are resistant to pesticides. But that's just one example, and it's not entirely natural selection, and the line is blurred there about whether it's kind of where natural selection and artificial selection meet, because in a way it's our fault that this is happening, but at the same time we're not actively selectively breeding for it. But I digress, and we need to move on because I'm going on a tangent. So this brings us to the origin of species, which is the work that Darwin is known for. So the full title of this book is On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. But again, that's a mouthful, so the origins of species is more than sufficient. Everyone will know what you're referring to if you just say the origin of species. In the early 1840s, Darwin had drafted this book. However, at the time he was calling it an essay. And the actual mind-boggling thing to me that this textbook doesn't mention, that I think should be mentioned, is that this entire work was written originally as an abstract. And an abstract, for those of you that don't know, is basically a synopsis or a summary of a scientific paper. So the idea of an abstract is that you look at it, it gives you a little intro, it tells you what they did very briefly, and kind of touches on their conclusion so that you know whether or not this paper is well relevant for you to read. This entire book was supposed to just be an abstract. This book that's hundreds of pages long was originally just going to be the abstract for a longer work. But again, I'm getting on a tangent here, and that's not the point of this slide. So, early 1840s, this was drafted, but Darwin delayed publication because again, his entire belief system had been shaken to the core by his discoveries. Remember, he grew up in a time where pretty much everyone believed that species were fixed. That's how they've always been. That's how they always will be. They do not change. And that the book of Genesis is a literal history of the earth, and the earth was thousands of years old. But in the course of his voyage and analyzing his work, his beliefs had been shaken, or his beliefs had been shook, and he knew that his work was going to be very controversial when it published. So he hesitated, and it wasn't until 1858 when he was talking to basically a colleague, or it came to his attention that a colleague, Alfred Russel Wallace, was actually working on an almost identical idea, but with data from a different part of the world, that Darwin realized if he wasn't going to publish his work, somebody else would. And since his was technically the first full work, he might as well go ahead and publish his. Since he's done all this work, this is his life's work at this point, it's nonsensical to not publish it. Now, I know that in at least one of my biology classes I took through middle school and high school, I don't remember which one, this was framed that Darwin basically stole the idea of publication from Wallace. But I think that it's very important to recognize that he didn't necessarily steal the idea from anyone. It's just that the field of biology was already converging on this idea anyway, and he already had this draft ready to publish. He just needed the extra kick in the pants to do it because, again, the origin of species was pretty much a middle finger to the face of the culture of the time. So the main idea of the origin of species is this idea of evolution by natural selection. So it's descent with modification, and the idea that living species are descended from these ancestral species. And those were very radical ideas for the time. And so since the publication of On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, there have been more than 150 years of research and supporting evidence to back up this hypothesis and elevate it to the throne of theory. So when someone says, oh, evolution is just a theory, your response should be, yeah, evolution is a theory, because it has a lot of evidence that back it up. It's not just a lot of evidence from the field of biology, but there's evidence from the fields of paleontology. If you go into different fields of biology, all of the evidence comes back to this idea of evolution by natural selection, which is a very broad idea. So it's just descent with modification. That's essentially what it is. So let's talk a little bit about this evidence. So the first bit of evidence we're going to talk about today is fossils and the fossil record. So a fossil is basically a preserved remnant or impression of an organism. So it can either be the organic matter itself in the bones or whatever have been replaced by minerals, or some impression of the animal has been left behind and preserved in some way. It could be a little more technical than that, but we're not going to get into more technical than that. Just know that fossils are kind of whispers of the past. And they're usually made when organisms are going to be buried very quickly in sediment. So most of the fossils we have come from like ancient sea floors and riverbeds and things like that. So where the organism would die and then very quickly be covered up with sediment so it didn't decompose. And when you are looking for fossils, you'll notice that the earth kind of forms in layers. So you'll have one layer of sediment that will kind of settle, and then new layers will form right on top of it and compress the older layers. And this will form strata. So the strata are literally just the layers, and the younger layers will always be on top and the older layers will always be on bottom. So because this is how the layers form, and it takes a very long time for a new layer to form, paleontologists are able to notice certain fossils only occur in certain strata. And now we have what is known as the fossil record, which is this chronicle of evolution based on where the fossils have appeared in the strata. And despite the fossil record being incomplete, it is amazingly detailed. Because remember, the fossil record is always going to be incomplete because for an organism to fossilize, there has to be a very specific set of conditions. But we still have this very detailed record of evolution in our fossils. Probably unsurprisingly to anyone at this point who's been watching this video, Darwin actually had a prediction about fossils, and his prediction was that fossils of transitional forms linking different groups of organisms together exist and can be found. And you know what? This prediction turned out to be pretty accurate, because one very exciting bit of confirmation comes from whale evolution, actually. And basically what you can see in this little image here is that there are fossils that have been found that track the loss of the hind limbs in whales. And that's actually a very fascinating thing to delve into. And I highly recommend, if you're interested in whale evolution, please look it up. I volunteered in an exhibit at a natural history museum for a while that was all about whale evolution, and it was fascinating. Unfortunately, we're not going to have time to dig into it here, but if you guys would like a video on whale evolution, let me know in the comments below and I'll be more than happy to oblige. I pinky promise. So it's a little more in-depth than just tracking the loss of the hind limbs, but that is the most obvious one that is found in these fossils. And as you can see, you can even kind of color code these fossils and see how the pelvis, the femur, the tibia, and the foot have all kind of shifted and even been reduced and lost. And there are, of course, other examples. Like we have the kind of transitional organism, or one of them, linking fish and amphibians. We also have many fossils that chronicle bird evolution as well. But again, we don't have time to get into this, but I'd be more than happy to dive into any of these topics in the future, and frankly, I probably will. But we need to move on here. So another evidence for evolution is the existence of homologies. Homologies are just these similar structures that are the result of shared ancestry. There are organisms that have very similar structures, like bird wings and bat wings, but they're not the result of shared ancestry. Basically, these are things that evolved because of a shared ancestor and some ancestral trait. We'll get more into the nitty-gritty of homologies and other things like that in future videos. The important thing here is that homologies are evidence for evolution. So we can see here in this depiction of the front limbs of a human, a cat, a whale, and a bat, that while these structures may seem different at first glance, when you begin looking at the bone structure, they're the same bones there, just in a bit of a different arrangement. And again, this is because they come from shared ancestry. And these structures that are similar due to shared ancestry but now have different functions, like we see here, are homologous structures. So the structures themselves are very similar, but they've been modified so that they perform different functions now. They are homologous structures. And again, they came from shared ancestry. So how do we know they came from shared ancestry? Well, now that we have the field of molecular biology, we can actually confirm that the shared ancestry and homology are there. So it's basically these little markers in the DNA and the genetic code that are like, yeah, there's the gene being expressed and these structures are homologous. There's a shared ancestor somewhere. And sometimes the most interesting form of homologies are leftovers. And these leftovers are known as vestigial structures. So basically, they're remains of structures that once served a purpose for the ancestors of the organism you are looking at. However, now they don't really serve a purpose. One example is the very small pelvis and sometimes existence of hind leg bones in not only ancestral whales, but even in some modern whales. You'll see remnants floating around in those anatomies. And these are just traces from their land-dwelling walking ancestors, which are one of the best evidences we have that whales came from a critter that was terrestrial. And another thing that we can look at that's a vestigial structure are eye remnants under the scales of blind cave fish. So it's just evidence that these fish had ancestors that at one point in time had eyes and could see, but something happened and eyes were no longer advantageous, or they were just a waste of energy or something, and the blind fish started to do better and new species evolved that was blind, but there's still eye remnants left behind, even though they don't serve a function anymore. And so another thing to keep in mind is that it's not just structures like that that can be left in mind, or except left behind. Organisms can actually retain genes even if they've lost their function. We're not going to go very in-depth in this one because it's a little bit harder to conceptualize than saying, oh, that pelvis bone in that whale, it doesn't really serve a function anymore. This is a little bit more confusing. So there's this gene that codes for the GLO enzyme, and we have it. This gene, however, no longer functions in us. What this enzyme does is it's used to synthesize vitamin C. And there are quite a few of our own close evolutionary family members, so other apes, that have this gene to code for this enzyme, but again, it doesn't function. So there are some mammals where this gene is functional. They can synthesize their own vitamin C from, I believe, glucose, if I'm remembering correctly. And basically, that means they don't get scurvy. As humans, we have the gene, but it doesn't function, so we still need to eat oranges. Seems a little unfair, but this is just one more remnant of, for some reason in our evolutionary history, this gene became non-functional, but we still have it in our genetic code even though it doesn't function. That's all I'm really going to say about that, because I know that that's a little confusing. That's a little hard to conceptualize. So before we wrap up, I want to talk about evolutionary trees for a second. And they're very similar to family trees. In the future, I will very likely do a video just on evolutionary trees, how to read them, how to make them. That probably won't be until July, just because time and life. But for now, we'll talk a little bit about the basics and then I will let you go. This lesson will be over for now, because I know this has been going on a little long, but again, these are things that I find fun and interesting, and I can ramble about them for an hour or so if I'm allowed to. But basically, an evolutionary tree is just a diagram that can map a hypothesis about an evolutionary relationship. You've probably all seen an evolutionary tree before and you just don't realize it. Basically, they're built on data, usually from homologies and or molecular biology. And they have these little branch points that you can see that are these little red dots. And those branch points just represent some hypothetical common ancestor. And they'll take these homologies, which again are shared ancestral traits, and represent them by the little hatch marks you can see on some of these lines. And these are things that kind of define that branch. And then the closer to related species are, the fewer the branching points between them. So as you can see in this evolutionary tree, the ostriches are much closer related to the hawks and other birds with only one branch point than they are to amphibians. Because if we count backwards, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 branch points between the ostriches and the amphibians. And there's only one branch point between the ostriches and the hawks and other birds. Again, I will get into that in more detail in the future, but this is a very quick and dirty idea of what an evolutionary tree is. Basically, they're just like a family tree that helps visualize a hypothesis of how things are related. And these evolutionary trees that we use even in the fields of biology, they're constantly changed as we get new data. So keep that in mind. One evolutionary tree is not necessarily going to ever be the end-all be-all of it, because science is constantly evolving, and as we get more data, we have to refine the knowledge that we have. So the big ideas that are the takeaway from this long-winded discussion that we had today is that evolution is descent with modification. Populations evolve, not individuals. We will talk more about that point in the next video. But I already want you to start thinking about that big idea. Because notice how we've been talking about populations, not individual things evolving, because individuals don't evolve. Evolution has no end goal. So while artificial selection has a goal because it's humans that are pulling the strings, natural selection does not. The evidence that supports evolution comes from multiple fields, not just one field, which is one of the things that has elevated evolution from hypothesis to theory, because there's a massive body of evidence supporting it, and that evidence comes from many different fields. And then natural selection is a process where individuals with certain traits are better able to survive and then reproduce than others. It is the driving force behind evolution, and it can only amplify or diminish heritable traits. And again, if you don't remember, heritable just means it's something that can be passed on from parent to offspring. Now, I know I've thrown a bunch of information at you today, and a large portion of the first part of the video is stuff that you probably don't have to remember. I apologize for that. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, afternoon, evening, what have you. I will see you all in the next one. Next week, we are going to expand a little more on how populations evolve.
Thank you again for watching this video. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and ring that bell if you would like to see more. And if you'd like to follow me on any of my other social medias, the links are down in the description below. Don't forget to check out thereptilegoth.com for all of my articles and blog posts. If you found any value in this video and you would like to help support the channel, please check out my Patreon page. That link is also in the description down below. And a special thanks goes out to my Diamond Dragon patron, Diane V. What you're doing is really helping me fund a dream here. I will see you guys all in the next one.